Hey guys, I am super excited for my new series, which is the Basic Knits series. And in this series, there's going to be several videos, all little short videos showing you all of the basics that you need to know in order to knit. Now, I started this series mostly for my students. I am a teacher at an elementary school, and I have an after-school knitting and crochet club. And I just wanted to create a resource where my students can go home. If they've forgotten how to do something, they have a video to go to that I have already vetted and know is going to teach them in the same language that I'm teaching them at school. So in this intro video, I'm going to go through the supplies that you'll need to learn to knit. So if you are teaching someone, this is a really good video to watch. If you are learning to knit yourself, this is also a really good video. So I'm going to go through the supplies and give you a couple tips before we get started. So as you are preparing to learn to knit, there's really only two things that you need. You need needles and you need yarn. But if you've ever been to a craft store or a yarn store, you know that it is not that simple. So I'm going to go through first how to pick out your yarn and then how to pick some needles. So when we're learning to knit or crochet, it is really good to start in the middle. And by that, I mean, don't pick anything that's too small. Don't pick anything that's too large. That goes for knitting and that goes for crochet. It also goes for yarn and it goes for needles. So the yarn that I have picked here is a medium weight yarn. It is a worsted weight, so probably about a size 4. This yarn in particular is Cascade 220 Superwash. So it is a wool that has been superwash treated so it feels super soft. This is not a yarn that you're going to pick up at a big box store like Joann's or Michael's. It is a yarn that does have to be purchased in a yarn store, but it is something that I had with me at home. When I'm selecting yarn for my students, I usually go to a big box store, so I know that it is something that is affordable for them and also really easy to pick up. It's really good that you choose a light colored yarn. Anything that is too dark is going to be hard to see, especially if you pick dark needles. Also, anything that is multicolored can be a little bit tricky to see as well. You definitely don't want to pick any yarn that is fuzzy or knobbly. You want something that is very smooth and medium weight. Okay, now let's talk about knitting needles. So the knitting needles that I like to get for my students are these clover needles, and they are wooden needles that are 9 inches long. Now that is very important because you can buy knitting needles that are 14 inches long, but they are very cumbersome and hard to learn to knit with. So make sure you get those 9-inch needles. I also particularly choose the clover wooden needles because 1, I know I can easily get them at Michael's and Joann's, and 2, I really like wood for beginners. It is not as slippery or as heavy as metal, so it's a little easier to manipulate. Also, unlike plastic, it's not quite as squeaky and sticky, and the points tend to be just a little bit sharper, which helps new knitters get into their stitches. Again, with knitting needles, you want to choose a size that is kind of in the middle. So I generally choose a US size 7, 8, or 9 for my students. This one that I have here, we might be able to see, is a US size 8, and it's a 5mm needle. So US size 8, 5mm. Now, as you know, if you are already a knitter, you can use straight needles to knit, or you can use circular needles. So I tend to teach people to knit on straight needles. And the reason is, it is a lot easier to distinguish between which needle you're knitting onto and which needle you're knitting off of if your needles are separate. Now, if you are a knitter, you know that generally, as you become more experienced, you are going to move over to circular needles. They're just a little bit easier to handle. So if you want to teach yourself or somebody else how to knit on circular needles, that is totally okay too. However, I would not recommend, and this is just my personal opinion, to get the same brand circular needles. The Clover circular needles that are sold in big box stores have a cord that is very kinky and hard to work with, which can be frustrating for a beginner. So my suggestion would be to get these needles. These are Knit Picks needles, but A very similar type would be Knitter's Pride, and both of these can be ordered online or they can be picked up at your local yarn store. I really like these because the cord is very flexible, it doesn't kink up, and it is really nice to use. These are 24 inches in length, which means from the one tip of the needle around to the other tip of the needle, it measures 24 inches, so we call them 24-inch circulars. Again, these are a size 8 needle, and you'll notice that mine are rainbow. These are the needles that I use just about every day on my own knitting projects. Now, Knit Picks does make different colors of needles, and I would actually suggest that you get their needles that look a little bit more like this. I believe they're called Beechwood, and those are the kind that I will be getting for my students this year. Like I said, I've only taught kids to knit, and adults too, using straight needles so far, but in reality, we know that many of us are gonna move over to circular needles. So I'm experimenting this year, and I am gonna teach my knitters on circular needles and see how it goes. Circular knitting needles work for both straight back and forth knitting and knitting in the round. They're a really good tool to have because they are so versatile for multiple projects. One last thing about knitting needles. The straight needles are going to be a much more accessible option. They're easier to find at big box stores, and they are generally more affordable than the circular needles. However, if you are interested in learning to knit and you see yourself doing this long term, circular needles are something that are definitely worth investing in. So let's talk about the videos that will be coming up in this Basic Knits series. The very first thing we're going to learn is how to make a slip knot. This is how you start any knitting project. The second thing that we're going to learn is, of course, getting our stitches onto the needles. And to do this, we're going to learn the long tail cast on. I've been teaching knitting for many years, and I enjoy teaching the long tail cast on. Usually the very first thing I do, my first session with my kids, is we do the slip knot and the long tail cast on, and they can pick it up no problem. Long tail is a cast on that I still use to this day, and I wish I had started out learning the long tail cast on. The second thing that we're gonna do is the third thing that we're going to learn to do is the knit stitch. Now I'm going to show you the knit stitch in as many ways as I can think of. I'm going to show you how to do the knit stitch holding the yarn in your right hand, which is English style. I'm going to show you that on straight needles and circular needles. And then I'm going to show you how to knit holding the yarn in your left hand, which is called continental knitting. And I'm also going to show you on straight and circular needles. Whenever you're learning to knit, it's gonna feel super awkward. So go ahead and give both of these options a try. You can see which one feels more comfortable to you, or maybe just less awkward. After we learn to knit, we're going to learn to purl, again, in all those different ways. And then finally, we're gonna learn to combine knitting and purling so you can see how you can make many things. Once you feel like you've mastered all of those basic knit stitches, we are going to learn how to do a classic bind off, which is how you can finish just about any project. So that's it. That's the Basic Knits series. These videos are going to be coming out one by one over the next few weeks as I prepare to get ready to teach students these same skills. Each video is going to be very short and only include one skill, but it might include both the straight and circular needles together. So make sure you just fast forward through the video if you want to see the other way. All right, if you are following along with me and you want to learn to knit or teach somebody to knit, go out there and get your materials and let's get started.